Well, hello. Welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast, where we talk with writers from all mediums and genres about themselves, their work, and advice they have for writers. I'm your host, Paul Zeidman, and my guest today is writer slash poet Sherre Vernon. We'll be talking to her about herself and her new collected book of poems, Translating Blue. Sherre, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Well, it's nice to have you here. And for those who are familiar with the show, we'd like to start things off talking about things we may have read or watched recently, if we liked them or we didn't like them or we don't want to have anything to do with them ever again. But I will go first just to give Sherre a little time to collect her thoughts, as it were. So, two items on the watching front. Because I've been on a bit of guess I call it a horror comedy kick lately. I forget which, it's Hulu via Disney Plus that's on streaming. It said, oh, you've been watching these, you would probably like Ready or Not 2. Under subtitle Here I Come, which is an immediate sequel to the previous one, which I watched a couple of years ago. I really liked that. This one was almost just as fun. A lot of silly silly gore, horror, and I've also noticed it's kind of continuing this trend. There's always this innocent person who has to be sacrificed by this demonic cult in order for the cult to maintain their immortality or some such business. And I just wonder how much longer we're going to be seeing variations on that. But so far, the ones I've been seeing, I've enjoyed. So that one falls into that category. And also, I'd seen this mentioned and illustrations on Instagram and on Blue Sky. It's this limited series on Netflix called The Amazing Digital Circus, which is a totally CG show, and it's kind of these people's personalities are kind of transplanted into a digital world, and they have to go through all of these adventures in order to just survive. And that's a very lousy way of describing it, but there's also a lot of emotion to it, and it gets into very adult territory at times. So it was really interesting, and it's like 9 episodes long. I just, and one thing I kept thinking throughout the whole thing, it's very surreal because it's all computer animation. And the people who put it together, wow, I don't know what they were on, but sometimes the imagery just got so wild and crazy. But the storytelling was really solid, and I enjoyed it a lot. I don't know if they have any plans to make a second season. I don't think they could because it's a very contained kind of show. But I enjoyed it a lot. And if you want to watch something that's very different and very an adult in subject matter for animation, then I would recommend that. But don't watch it with children because they're not going to enjoy it at all.
Okay.
I think yeah, that's about it for me. So, Sherre, what about you? Anything for the reading or watching fronts?
Sure. I've been thinking about it, and I also watched a limited series, and I can't recall which one it is. And I'm just like you said, you don't think of it. But what I will tell you is that, in the moments that I've been sort of doom scrolling, the algorithm has been feeding me old clips of Buffy the Vampire Slayer.
Huh.
And so I am watching these little 30-second, 90-minute, outtakes of a show I watched decades
Yeah, I was going to say
ago.
25, 30 years ago.
Yes, and it's really interesting to see them without context, right? These scenes that you watched, probably I watched, season 1 to season 7, probably binge watched it the last time I watched it, which was less than 25, but probably in the realm of 15 years ago. And just seeing these little clips and watching my own internal reaction to them, right? Do I still respond to them? Do I not? What do I think of the costume? What do I think of the acting? What do I think of this? What do I think of that? All that to say that I love funny, well written fantasy sci-fi, and I feel like there's just an absence of it. I don't write
Hmm.
it. Maybe that I could be contributing, but I'm not. And so yeah, that's what I love to consume. And in the absence, I end up reading a lot of easy read YA books that I couldn't even tell
Hmm.
you the titles. That I
Sure.
download them on my Kindle and I read them while I'm falling asleep. Yeah, there's my confession.
Okay, I was going to say, and what a great way to tie it in that Sarah Michelle Gellar has a supporting part in Ready or Not 2, Here I Come. So it
Mm-hmm.
was interesting,
Mm-hmm.
great to see that she's still working, but also she's
Mm-hmm.
kind of, I guess, still keeping her toes in the horror comedy
Mm-hmm.
scene. So, but
Mm-hmm.
it a great Great connection there. Okay, so Sherry Vernon, let us talk about you before we get to your book, Translating Blue. I'm going to read the about the author page, which is in the back of the book. Sherry Vernon is the award-winning author of Green Ink Wings, The Name is Perilous, and Flame Nebula, Bright Nova. Sherry has been published in journals such as Tahoma Literary Review and the Chestnut Review, nominated for Best to the Net and Pushcart prizes, and anthologized in several collections, including Fat and Queer and Best Small Fictions. All right, so Sherry, let's talk a little bit about you and your background. I mean, have you
Sure.
always been a writer? Have you always been very interested in poetry? I like to ask the guest, like, were you a voracious reader as a child, or was writing something you came into a little bit later in life?
I'll start with the reader question. I read everything: shampoo bottles, billboards, books that were way over my reading level in the library, pamphlets, newspapers, anything I could get my hands on, I read. And I often learned words by reading, so mispronounced them,
Hmm.
as I would attempt to use them, which is a fun thing to do. I am a first generation college graduate. I grew up in a blue collar household, so I ended up almost in my own world in this reading place. It wasn't something that was common in my home, so it was sort of a bubble around me. And I loved it. I've always loved reading. I've always loved words, the sounds words make. When I remember writing poetic stuff probably as early as middle school, maybe earlier. And I really started exploring this idea of being a poet in my 20s because had emotions. I had all the emotions that late teens, early 20-year olds have, and words were the medium that I understood. I didn't write great poetry at that time, but I wrote it. Um, and in my late 20s, I was living in North County, San Diego, and I, by happenstance, by desperation, started attending community poetry events, community poetry readings, and started learning what I liked to listen to and what I liked to read. And I also, some of them took place at an independent bookstore, and I remember buying, all by myself, not an assignment, not a library book, not anything. I was drawn to Michael Ondaatje's the collected works of Billy the Kid, which is it's a collection of poetry, but it's a novelized
Hmm.
collection, and it wasn't something that I would have necessarily. I just had it was well displayed. I picked it up. It was interesting. It had photographs in it, and I accidentally started reading Michael Ondaatje, and that was pivotal because his poetry is beautiful and it's stunning and it's rich, and it was almost a different genre than community poetry, right? It very different. Um, One thing led to another. I did some poetry slams. I did all right in them. I wasn't like a big slam competitor, but I did all right. But I was also drawn to poetry on the page, which is, like I said, it's just different. And I wanted
Hmm.
both. I wanted the sound of poetry, the beautiful sound of poetry that are, I think, reverberating in our bones from our ancestors. And I wanted the literary, thoughtful, like visual aspect of poetry that can happen when you're working on a page. And neither audience fully appreciated, in my point of view, the benefits of the other, right? Like
Hmm.
the folks who wanted slam, the folks on the page wanted the page, and I wanted and at some point in my life, I decided to go back to graduate school. I did not get an MFA. It wasn't in the cards for me. I had life obligations in the form of a younger brother. I had custody of it. I needed to stay where I was. There wasn't an MFA local to me. But I did get an MA, and I was able to write a creative thesis, and I took some workshops, and I really I don't know, sowed the seeds of myself as a poet. That was in the early 2000s too. And I published Green Ink Wings and my chapbook, The Name is Perilous, very early, before 2010, and both award winning. And then I was teaching, and I was teaching in the K-12 system, and I felt like I stopped writing until for quite a while. And my brother also passed around the time that those two books came out. And it wasn't until I had my daughter in 2017 And in the couple years after that, that I felt this deep compulsion to write again and to be a writer again. And that was the journey that took me to my first full length poetry collection, Flame Nebula, Bright Nova, and also introduced me to Maya, the publisher at Poetos, and later maybe opened the door for translating Blue. So a long story short, maybe.
No, that's a great story. I especially love the power of the sound of words that you were talking about. It's so resonant, to use an appropriate word. Why do you think that maybe some poems are more effective spoken and some are more effective written on the page? Or maybe or
Yeah.
are they just like two different worlds?
I think the most effective poems are the ones that you get something extra depending how you receive them, but they still are powerful in whichever way you receive them. And I think you just like any art, whether you're working, we can say visual arts, right? But what you get from a watercolor versus what you get from a sculpture you can touch is different, even though they're both visual arts, right?
Hmm.
So I think it's similar in when you're talking about spoken word and or poetry that's read. You just have different tools. Meter lands differently. The poet's dialect lands in a way that you don't necessarily get off the page. What they do with what the score of the blank space tells the poet who wrote the poem is different than what it might tell the reader.
Hmm.
That's reading the poem in their head. And then when you're working on a page, you have all these tools that are different than spoken tools. You have a line break, and a line break becomes a new unit of punctuation. And it can coincide with the breath, but it doesn't have to coincide with the breath. And it literally creates a unit of meaning within the sentence for a lot of double meaning, for a lot of play on words that you don't necessarily get if you only hear the poem.
Hmm.
And there's other tools. There's concrete poetry that you can't visualize what you're seeing. Like there's different things and
Sure.
form. You know.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. That's great. So what I'd like to ask the guest is that we're going to talk about now, leading up to your book Translating Blue, is that for screenwriting, it's the elevator pitch. You get on an elevator. Steven Spielberg or a big exec is there, and you've got 5 seconds to explain what your script is about. But for authors and poets, it's a little different. That I like to call it what's the cocktail party pitch. You're there, you've got your beverage in hand, and someone says, "Oh, Sherry, I heard you about this new collection of poems called Translating Blue. What are some of the poems about, or what would you say is there a theme to the book? I mean, how would you pitch the book of
Yeah.
Translating Blue?"
Mm. It's about identity, and it's about trying to be understood and understand others in the world, and how every conversation, whether we think of it this way or not, is a translation. It's a translation from my experience to your understanding, your experience to my understanding, and we try to translate incomprehensible things. Um, and somehow we manage, and in some ways we don't manage, and we cause harm to each other when we do that. And we also sometimes reveal beautiful things we wouldn't have thought to reveal.
No, that's great. That's beautiful. I love that. So I'm curious. So there's a good sized number of poems in Translating Blue. What was I guess the inspiration for the collection? Was this like you just said, "Oh yeah, I'm going to write. Well, I'm going to write one today," and "Oh hey, I've got an idea for another one the next day," or was it spread out over like several months or even years to put
Yeah.
to amass this collection?
There are poems in Translating Blue that are 20 years apart, maybe
Oh,
more. So the way that I wrote as a younger writer, I just wrote what came to me, and as I began to study the craft of writing as an art and as a craft, I wrote to prompts or exercises as well. So I had these very like necessary poems, and then I had these poems that I was experimenting with, and then sometimes I just wrote because I observed something or a sound got stuck in my head, a phrase, and I built around it. But I wasn't building a collection. But I ended up with a lot of poems. And I had finished Flame Nebula Bright Nova, which is my first book, which is about motherhood. And it's about that shift in identity and growing up in a very difficult context, but hopefully creating a beautiful child, right? Flame Nebula Bright Nova. And that book was cohesive. It was about a thing, even though it
Mm,
also had poems that were, in some cases, years apart, written years apart. For the others, I had tried a few different sortings, right? There's a lot of strategies when you're putting together a poetry collection. And I had tried sorting this in, sorting that out. And at some point, um, this idea of translation, this idea of blue, surfaced, and I began to coalesce the poems around this concept. And I had plenty. I had extra. I actually had to move poems out of the collection. I am trying to recall if I wrote anything specifically for translating blue to fill a gap. And I think maybe one, maybe two poems. Yeah, it's clearer in Flame Nebula. I specifically remember writing a poem that had to fill a gap. But I think with translating blue, it was much more about the arrangement, and it
mm,
was much more about the sequencing. And I had received some early feedback from another writer because we trade, manuscripts as feedback, and they had wanted me to move some poems toward the end, and I thought, oh, but that changes the arc. It changes the
mm.
arc. And it felt good to have that confidence that I knew where I wanted this poem to go, or
Okay,
this
actually,
collection of poems.
I want to touch on something you mentioned is that like some of the poems were like 20 years apart or maybe 20 years in the making. Did you take any of the older material, then you look at it with, fresh eyes, more experienced eyes, and you realize, oh, okay, I could figure out ways to change it or revise it, or, oh my God, what was I thinking? And just, and just like, I'm just going to start over from square one.
Mm-hmm. Um, a little bit.
Mm,
So I worked with a really great copy editor, and her name's Marge Hahn. And she has a rule, and the rule is your book is consistent. So if you were using semicolons 20 years ago and you're using M-dashes now, you need to choose. Like
mm,
your poems it needs to hold itself together in your mannerism as a collection. So there was some just consistency around choices I now had as an aesthetic as a writer, so that it felt cohesive that way, from the copy editing standpoint. Another thing that comes up with translating blue, and I had to make a decision around, was the use of pronouns. Because in translating blue, is the beloved, is it a she? Is it a they? Is it a we? Who's the beloved? Is a question that is valid to be asked. And sort of the MFA, if I may speak as a receiver of MFA advice from people who have them versus folks who don't, it really wants to push a collection toward a very clear cast of characters. And I decided not to do that. I decided on purpose that the ambiguity of love, the plurality of love, because there's a lot of love in this book, is important to me as a queer person, as a person who had to struggle through their identity and make sense of ways of being in the world, and that weren't offered to me, I guess, when I was growing up. And so um, that doesn't mean I didn't consider pronouns. I say this as context to say I really sat with the pronouns of almost every poem and
mm.
asked myself, are these the right pronouns for this poem? Even if it had been published, perhaps with different pronouns. And then just some tidying here and there where the spirit moved, like, I want a line break somewhere else, or maybe there's too many words here.
Sure, sure.
You know,
Okay. No, I totally get that. I thought it was really interesting that there's a wide assortment of, I don't want to call them categories, but you talk about experiences, but you also talk about emotions and sensations. What is it that I guess, motivates you or inspires you to put a poem together? Is it something like maybe something you've been mulling over for a while, or all of a sudden you're just, you're feeding your cats, and all of a sudden, oh my God, you got suddenly a bolt from the blue of her inspiration. You just, zip over and you jot it down. I mean, is there any particular process, or is it just it happens when it happens?
that's a great question. There are plenty of writers that will advise and say you must write every day and you must write a certain amount and you must do this, and I don't subscribe to that. So I've had dry spells of years where I've written a poem or two in a span of years, and I've had spells where I'm writing almost daily. And for me, I try to strike a balance because if I'm writing almost daily, it's usually coming from a place of grief or pain or something that I really need to process. I don't like to live in that space. I'm grateful for the art when it arrives to help me through that space, but that's not where I want to be. And then I do try to explore the world. I try to be observant. I try to write poems from observation as well. And then like you mentioned, sometimes I'm just living my life and a phrase or an image or a rhythm will offer itself and then I'll build around it. Sometimes I make myself voice memos. Sometimes I scratch things down in a notebook and come back to them when I've forgotten what they were originally about and see what art I can make from them.
No, that's great. You touched on this a little bit earlier. That I was looking through the book, all the works in Translating Blue. A lot of them follow a very unique, I guess I'd call it a placement system, like how things are positioned on the page. You're talking about line breaks. I've also noticed like a lot of times a sentence will be broken up. There's a space between like two stanzas, but the sentence
Mm-hmm.
is incomplete and leads to the next one.
Mm-hmm.
Is that just the way you prefer to do it? Do you like the way it looks on the page? Do you think it's more impactful that way?
Mm-hmm. I would say it depends on the poem. Some of the poems in Translating Blue are formal verse. For example, there are poems in there. There's the poem the title comes from is a duplex, which is a type of poem. It's a modern form created by the poet Jericho Brown, and it has certain rules you have to follow as you're writing the poem. There's others in there that are formal as well. So when that is the case, I'm following the rules of the form or following them ish. I don't always follow them strictly. But there, that's why that happens. And then, as I mentioned when I was talking about line breaks, um, it's it adds a layer, it adds a pause. So whether you're at a single line and you have a break, or you're at the end of a stanza and you have a break, it tells you take this as a unit of meaning in addition to the sentence unit, in addition to perhaps the paragraph unit. And so, yeah, it adds layers of meaning. Mhm.
Oh, that's great. That's great. You said at the outset that part of the reason you're so into the writing is that you love the sound of words, and I couldn't help but notice that even on the first page and scattered throughout the rest of the books in Translating Blue, there are words that I've never heard before. Like even in the very first one, "If by light," you use the word palimpsest. Or wait,
Mm.
palimpsest,
Palimpsest.
palimpsest. I
Mm-hmm.
was like, and it's like I had, it's like you're forcing me to dig up the dictionary. So palimpsest was one. I think bone tremble is another word that's in there somewhere, and there was a third word which I couldn't find it after I finished the book.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have particular or specific words in mind while you're writing it, or do you use like a placeholder word and you're like, okay, I'm going to use the word cat for right now, just as an example. But then you go back and think, what's a more powerful word, a more impactful word, or a word
Right.
that has a higher resonance that affects the whole sensation of reading the poem?
That's a great question. So, generally speaking, the words that are there are the words that are available to me. I'm not usually digging for unfamiliar words for
Hmm.
myself. I sometimes compound words that without permission from anyone. But
Sure.
in terms of palimpsest, it's a word I know. It's a word in my dialect, right?
Okay.
It is. And I'm not saying it should be in everyone's, but I tend to use words that are available to me or some new rearrangement of them. What I actually find myself sometimes having to do is edit the opposite way. If a word appears too frequently in a group of poems, and I don't want that emphasis between the poems, I
Hmm.
sometimes have to go in and find a synonym for because that word isn't. I'm not trying to emphasize it between the group of poems, and so I will sub it out. If I want the resonance, I will leave that repetition. Like blue is all
Hmm.
over in this book. I didn't purposefully, try to find synonyms for blue to edit them out because I announced on the cover it was going to happen, right? So, yeah.
Okay. Well, on that note, not that it's about a word in particular, but there are several poems in throughout the book that involve Russia or some kind of connection with Russia. So I'm guessing there's like a personal thing there, but you're also not, coming out and explaining this is why this is about Russia. There's a lot of I guess subtext is one way to put it. There's another implying other things. Was that just another part of the, this is an experience, or this is something that I was inspired by to include this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I almost didn't publish this book because of the political climate that we're in and the fact that it does talk about Russia. And I had to sit with my decision about it back and forth because when I went to Russia, it was the mid 90s.
Hmm.
And that's when my experiences were there. And they were pivotal to my identity. And they were in conversation, the poems about Russia were in conversation with this idea of translating identity from one person to another, from one culture to another. And I already mentioned with the pronouns that I have a sort of thesis in the book that plurality is important, right? That complexity is important. And I would like to believe that we can believe there's goodness in any culture and any group of people, regardless of where. I would like to believe there's goodness here in the US right now. Right. I'd like to believe that we don't have to shun every aspect of something that is complicated and I don't know, difficult to talk about. So those are some of the older poems.
Sure, sure.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, I like how some of the poems, they're almost like brief glimpses into you, the actual writer, during a particular, excuse me, a particular moment in time. How do you gauge how much or how little you're allowing the reader to, quotes unquote, see about you? I mean, as you say, you talk about some of these things involving Russia. I think there's one or two involving about being a mother and about just parts of your life. How do you know, or how do you figure out how much you're willing to show?
Yeah. I mean, I think the key word is there is willing, right? It's about my own comfort with that topic. Um, Sometimes I tend to be fairly open in general. It's how I like to live my life. As I get older, though, I realize that it's not just my life; it's the life of people I interact with, and I've tried to develop a greater tenderness for others that show up in my writing.
Hmm.
So one thing that I do, and I do it in a few poems in here, is I apply a concept that I learned from the poet Richard Hugo or the writer Richard Hugo. And his concept is that the moment that sparks the poem doesn't, or the writing, doesn't have to be the moment that the reader receives. So I can take my memory, change it seven different ways. It's like Picasso painting cubism versus realism. I can
Hmm.
change it all these ways. And for me, it still reminds me of my specific memory or experience. But you, as the reader, you're getting an artistic version of it. You're not getting creative nonfiction. Poetry isn't creative nonfiction, it's a different type of art.
Hmm.
So while there are biographical elements in it, not all of the poems are strictly autobiographical,
Right.
which allows me to feel more comfortable with the pieces that perhaps I didn't want it to be so obvious who or what sparked that poem or sparked that piece of art.
Sure, I was thinking that it's your interpretation of something that may have actually happened, but for us, the reader, we're taking that not as gospel, but like that's the truth, like that's what it was. So it's two different interpretations, or actually maybe even three different interpretations. There's, the truth, your interpretation, and the reader's interpretation, and
Right.
then the reader might even like try to dig even deeper. So it
Yes.
keeps getting deeper. I thought it was really interesting that. As again, we talked about how the poems are placed on the page. There's a lot of just stanzas and broken lines, but there's also one right in the middle. I hope I'm saying this right. Hotel key,
It
and
sounds
that
like
it is it
Hotelki.
is it is a
Hotelki. Mm-hmm.
it is it's. I thought that was so different, and I was thinking, what was the motivation
Why?
behind that? Did you want to just do something different? Did you think this will work? This will read much better if you have to turn the book sideways?
Yeah. So the poem is a form. It's a ghazal. It's a received form from another language, but it's written in couplets.
Hmm.
And if you look at the ends of the lines of the couplets, you'll see there's certain patterns of sound or words that are happening. Trying to fit that poem on even this page, not even a standard book, which is narrower, would force those lines to wrap around, which then obscures the form of the poem and obscures the purpose of the poem. And so my editor and I looked at it and we talked about it. And like you said, it's not the only poem in the book doing something a little
Mm,
odd. So we felt that um, it would be appropriate to keep it in the form, make it observe that form. And it also sort of the title means something like a wish list, and you want it to look like a list, right? You want it to visually look um, sequentially, not like paragraphs that are wrapping
hmm
around themselves.
I was going to say, I'm sure the printer really, really appreciated you as well. One of the things I thought was really a unique idea is that once you get through the whole collection of poems, that there's a notes section where it's almost like here's the little backstory about the poems. I
Yeah,
really thought it was going to be like one for every single poem, but that's not the case. Some of them are, it's a not a dense paragraph, but it's a sizable paragraph. Another one is like here's one sentence description for this poem. But what was the inspiration for doing that? Did you just feel like, okay, here's this poem, and rather than leaving it up to the reader's total interpretation, here's a little backstory. But also, what I noticed is that after I would read the note, I'd be like, okay, now I have to go back and read the poem. Am I reading
mm.
it in a different way? Does it coming across is it come across differently than when I first read it?
I wrote them because I love to read them. When I get books that have notes, I love it. I love those little extra nuggets, and I do the same thing. I go back and I reread, whatever it is that has the extra note in there. So because I enjoy it, I thought, well, maybe there's others that might enjoy this. And I think it also addresses some of that ambiguity, some of that autobiographical pieces, especially because I knew that I wasn't going to choose to clarify some of these things in the poems themselves. I knew that as pieces of art, I wanted them to stay as I presented them, but I could also understand maybe a little explanation here might be interesting or helpful for the
Hmm
reader if they want it. And like you said, they can take it, they can leave it, they can have their own interpretation, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah, that does play into the like why is it only some of the poems have notes and others don't? I thought, there's a reason behind that, but if Sherry's not willing to tell us what it is, or maybe there's something that the notes help explain to add some depth to the meaning of the poem, but again, it's all up to the
Yeah.
interpretation of the reader. I'm very curious. So again, Sherry Vernon, and the book is Translating Blue. What have been reactions and responses to the collection? And as a follow-up question to that, have any of the poems particularly resonated with readers? Like people getting back to, I love the book, but I especially love, fill in name of poem here.
Yeah. Thank you for asking. I mostly have I mean you can get the book from the publisher or on the website, but when I have it out I'm usually at a reading and
Hmm
people tend to like the poems I read, right? You tend to hear the poem, it brings you to the page, and you're more likely to spend a little bit of time with them. I would say that the poem After Hiking the Coast is one that, when published separately, like ahead of time of the book, was one that got some strong positive reactions from some fellow poets. The title poem "Relocation" that has the phrase "translating blue" in it has the guzzles with the long couplets. You aren't the first one to mention it. It just depends on the audience. I feel like people respond to the poems that they can that bring something up for them, right? Whether it's just
hmm
curiosity or to use the word we've used already, resonant
Yeah.
experience. Yeah.
I am curious. So, for when you've done the readings, I like to think that the people who are attending, they've read the book already. So, has anyone said, "Oh, you reading this poem aloud, it was much different than, I guess, how I heard it in my head," and so it came across differently, or it had a different impact than how I was expecting it to, or than from what I remember while reading it. I mean, has that happened, or has everyone said, you read it just like I imagined it?
You have a lot of optimism around poetry readings. People usually have not read the poet's work ahead of time. Sometimes they have, sometimes they haven't. Usually not, and usually not the whole book. So thank you for the work you did to read it. I got that criticism a lot more when I was a younger or newer poet. And it went into, and I don't say criticism necessarily as negative, but I got that feedback. And it went into that tension you and I talked about between sound and the page.
Hmm.
And I really worked on bridging my reading and the page, not completely, but so that it was a translation, so that what I read wasn't so drastically different from the page that if someone was looking at the page, their experience would be jarring.
Sure.
So I've done a lot of work on that. That said, um, I I read well, and people tend to appreciate the reading. I think it adds a different dimension, and I feel lucky because I got to come up in spoken word. I got the training or the exposure or the opportunity to listen to people read well, and learn from that. You know, not all poets who publish books have had that background. You know, to read that way.
Sure, sure. Okay, so the collection of poems, this is Translating Blue. So what is next? I mean, do you have another collection in the works? Are you just like, I'm still amassing my next collection?
I have two manuscripts that I'm circulating, and one of them I just finished, and it is there's a on my website which you're going to share. If you go to the page for poetry, there's a YouTube video, and that YouTube video is of an animated short that was done with one of my poems. That poem is entitled "Grief Song," and the book is, should it get picked up, will be entitled Grief Song as well. And it is a book about grief, and it is a book about two major losses in my life, my brother and my niece. And also, there are a few poems written during our collective loss of the pandemic. And um, it's a sadder collection, but for me, a very important collection. When I lost my brother, and then again when I lost my niece, Brenda Hillman's collection, Death Tractates, was very powerful for me, and I read it. And there aren't a lot of books that I have found meet that need. Right, when you're going through grief and you need to sit with something and you need to hear that, I'll use resonance again, resonance of your pain, and also, you know, something lovely in the humanity of it too. So I feel tenderly about translating blue, but I feel tenderly about grief song as well. And then the other one, we'll see about the fourth one, whether it gets picked up. But it's not as I don't have to hold it with such care, maybe.
Sure, sure. Do you ever feel the urge or the need or feel compelled, I'm going to write a short story or I want to write a fictional thing
Yeah.
and I mean like just like something you've never tried before or like, I've always had a hankering to write, a whodunit, that type of thing.
So my first book that was published was actually I wrote as my creative thesis to my master's degree, and it is called Green and Queens, and it is a novella, and it won a fiction prize, but it is multi-genre. It's definitely what we would call a hybrid work now. And I have run one contest for fiction, and uh, one of my lyric essays is, I think I have two things maybe collected in best small fictions on two different years. And I have read short stories, and I mean, performed short stories, right? What I mean by reading them, and published them, and essays. I'm not convinced a full length novel
Hmm.
is for me. I tend to prefer short form writing, even short form collected versus a sustained plot. And that is, I think, because once I know the plot, I'm not so interested in writing it.
Huh.
I like to discover as I'm writing, and the work that's required for a novel
Sure.
is a sustained. I don't know, sitting with something that maybe doesn't surprise me the way that it would otherwise.
I was going to say you're probably familiar with the phrase, pantser versus plotter, and so
Mm-hmm.
we've had
Yeah.
I've talked to both. We've had also like one or two writers who were like, I do both. So maybe you fall into that category. What advice would you give for writers, not necessarily just for poets, but writers overall? But if there's maybe something like a guideline or a tenet that you've really adhered to as part of your writing? Would you be willing to pass it along?
Yeah, there's a few, I think. One, as we discussed, read. I mean, read everything. Read everything. It is a powerful tool for a writer. And when we have a writer that's not a reader, I feel bad for them. They're missing out on the magic of their art and of their medium and craft. Um, and the other one, I think maybe it's harder, and that is you need peer review. You need peer review, and sometimes peer review means you're exchanging with other writers. It often means that in that publication, everybody wants their work published. Rejection is part of it.
Hmm.
And rejection isn't a rejection of you, it's not a rejection of your identity. It is an opportunity for you to sit with your art and say, hi, I wonder why. I wonder what's going on. Is it not a match for this journal? Is it not a match for this anthology? Or perhaps did I actually spend time with this the way an architect would spend time with a blueprint? Or did I just put my feelings out, which is a thing to do? I put my feelings out in pottery. I've been doing, I put my feelings out, but it's not the same work that somebody who's been doing pottery and
Hmm.
studying it and teaching it for 30 years has done. And I don't know all those things. And if a potter who has been doing this for their life says, would you like feedback on your pottery? I know that I'm going to learn something that's new to me versus me feeling that my year and a half of experience
Hmm.
is sufficient, right? And I think sometimes when it comes to writing, because we use writing in email and text and a note on the fridge, we think we have all the skills. And I would say, like any art, people have been doing this for millennia. There are things we can learn from each other and from the collective community.
No, that's great stuff. I love that. We have been talking today with Sherre Vernon and her book of poems, Translating Blue. Sherry, where can people find out more about you? I mean, a website and what social media platforms are you on that people can
Mm.
follow you there as well?
Yeah. So you can find me at www.sherrevernon.com. My name is spelled Sherrevernon. There are no I's and no Y's in there. You can find me there, and there's a few different links. There's one for poetry. You can see my publications. There's other things. And then in terms of platforms, you'll probably find me easiest on Instagram, but I do have the same handle in most platforms, and that is just at Sherre Vernon.
At Sherre Vernon. And again, the website is sherryvernon.com. I love the no I's or Y's. That's
Yeah,
great.
so, mhm.
Sherry, thank you so much for being here today. And again, your book is Translating Blue, a very wide assortment of very uh, intense poems. I think that's probably the best way to put them. A lot of them hit home very, very strongly. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Okay, and viewers and listeners, thank you for being here as well. And if you enjoyed today's show, please hit like, feel free to leave a comment and subscribe. Our theme music for the audio portion of this show is by Mark Gunyon. And for my social media, you can check out my screenwriting blog that is maximumz.blog. This show is on Blue Sky and Instagram at podcastcwl. I'm also on Blue Sky and Instagram at Pez Screenwriting. Yes, Pez, just like the candy. And you can check out my trio of Go Ahead and Ask books. Those are the ones on Amazon. They're about screenwriting and pie, two very wonderful things. Like I said, that's Sherry. I'm Paul. This has been the Creative Writing Life podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, go write something.